coming up on the end of the Gospel of Matthew here. And so last week we studied the cross. This week we're going to take a look at the resurrection. And so is the death of the Messiah figure in this story the start of an endless hope, or is it the hopeless end of this movement? And so I'm going to take a slightly different angle on this than I generally do at Easter. I'm going to use some different source materials, and I'm going to add a few additional arguments. But the thrust of the message that we're doing this morning is pretty much the same as the one that we do at Easter. So, this ought to seem a little bit familiar to some of you. And the place that this message starts is by asking the question, does this really matter? Is the resurrection really all that important? And the Bible answers that question for us. Yes. All right. It does matter, and it is really important. And one of the clearest places that you can go to in the Bible to see that that's true is 1 Corinthians 15. Starting in verse 14, Paul writes, "If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. Your faith also is vain." And so if you ask the Apostle Paul if the subject of the resurrection of Christ is important, he would say, yeah, all right, it sure is. And if Christ has not been raised, then all of the other teachings about Christ, it's futile. Your faith in Jesus is completely in vain, is what he's saying. Verse 15 goes on and it says, "Moreover, we are even found to be false witnesses of God, because we testified against the God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if in fact the dead are not raised." So if Jesus didn't raise from the dead in a literal way, then the disciples of Jesus are all liars, because they said that he did raise from the dead. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You're still in your sin. So if Paul said the same thing here, 3 different ways now, and then this is the 4th way to say it, if Jesus hasn't been raised, then you're still guilty before God. All right. So payment for sin didn't happen. Those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If Jesus didn't raise from the dead, then all of the Christians throughout all of history that have died are in hell right now. And if we have hoped in Christ in this life only, we are of all men most to be pitied. So a lot of Christians believe that Jesus really just kind of lives on in our hearts. He didn't literally come back to life. But that's not actually the testimony of the Bible. The Bible teaches that Jesus physically rose from the dead. And the subject or the teaching of the resurrection is mentioned nearly 300 times in the New Testament. It's connected to every major biblical doctrine and every practical application of the Christian life. And so it shouldn't surprise us that Paul would write this. Okay, the entire New Testament is built upon the foundation of the resurrection. So then Paul writes, "But now Christ has been raised from the dead." And according to Paul, that changes everything. All right. So this is where our passage for this morning starts. This is Matthew 27. We're starting in verse 55. We're going to be reading almost as much of the text as we did last week. So, follow along in your Bible or on the screen, whatever. We got some reading to do here. It says, "And many women who had come from Galilee with Jesus to care for him were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee. As evening approached, Joseph, a rich man from Arimathea who had become a follower of Jesus, went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate issued an order to release it to him. Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a long sheet of clean linen cloth. He placed it in his own new tomb, which had been carved out of the rock. Then he rolled a great stone across the entrance and left. So most crucifixion victims have their body like eaten by dogs and birds as a final resting place. And so, it's kind of interesting that the Bible teaches that Jesus was kind of buried in a rich man's tomb. And the way that these tombs were closed was not like with a giant boulder. All right. When it says that there's a rock, it's not like just a big random rock. It was a carved flat cylinder, like a round piece of stone, and it had a little ditch dug out in front of the opening, and the flat disc of stone would roll back and forth in this ditch. And it was really just to keep the tomb secure from like dogs and that kind of thing. Both Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting across from the tomb and watching. The next day on the Sabbath, the leading priests and Pharisees went to see Pilate. They told him, "Sir, we remember what that deceiver once said while he was still alive. After 3 days, I will rise from the dead. So we request that you seal the tomb until the third day. This will prevent his disciples from coming and stealing his body." All right, so a seal from the Roman government was kind of a big deal. They sealed the opening with a rope, and if the seal were broken, they would be able to see it easily, and the wrath of the Roman Empire would come down on you. It's not that different than like crime scene tape like we use now. And along with the government seal would go a military guard of about 20 Roman soldiers. And so that's what these people are asking for here. And Pilate replied, "Take guards and secure it the best you can." So they sealed the tomb and posted guards to protect it. Early on Sunday morning, as the new day was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went out to visit the tomb. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, rolled aside the stone, and sat on it. His face shone like lightning, and his clothing was as white as snow. The guards shook with fear when they saw him, and they fell into a dead faint. Then the angel spoke to the women. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I know you're looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He isn't here. He's risen from the dead, just as he said would happen. Come, see where his body was lying. And now go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You'll see him there. Remember what I have told you." The women ran quickly from the tomb. They were very frightened, but also filled with great joy, and they rushed to give the disciples the angel's message. And as they went, Jesus met them and greeted them, and they ran to him, grasped his feet, and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go tell my brothers to leave for Galilee, and they will see me there." So maybe you remember way back in Matthew chapter 4, Satan asked Jesus to worship him. And Jesus responded by saying that you should worship no one but God himself. And so here in verse 9 of this chapter, these women bow down and they start worshiping Jesus. And he's totally cool with that. All right, it doesn't bother him one bit. And so this is clearly intended to communicate something specific to the original audience. All right, so Jesus himself is the Lord that they should be worshiping. He is God himself. And that's exactly the conclusion that Matthew's drawing his gospel towards. All right, so people find faith in Jesus Christ, who is God incarnate. Right? As the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and told the leading priests what had happened. A meeting with the elders was called, and they decided to give the soldiers a large bribe. They told the soldiers, "You must say, Jesus' disciples came during the night while we were sleeping, and they stole his body. If the governor hears about it, we'll stand up for you so that you won't get in trouble." And so these guards actually could get in pretty big trouble. And so at this time, Roman law was that if you had a prisoner or if you were in charge of someone and that person got away somehow, then you would have to take their place. And so in this case, these guys would have to be crucified and killed the way that Jesus was. So they're being offered a pretty good deal here. So the guards accepted the bribe and said what they were told to say. Their story spread widely among the Jews, and they still tell it today. And in fact, they do still tell it to this day. All right, so many people believe that the empty tomb is the result of the disciples stealing the body. All right, so it's kind of a cool story, right? Most of us have heard it a whole bunch of times, like every Easter, our whole lives. But, you know, it's cool. It's got like some political intrigue. It has stolen bodies. There are angels appearing on rocks. There's all kinds of cool stuff in this story. But how can we know that this happened? And that's really where we land, I think, when we're talking about this kind of thing. How do we know that Jesus really rose from the dead? And what's the evidence, if there is any, that this really happened? And so most people that even believe in the resurrection think that it's something that you believe because you've decided to believe it on the basis of faith. If you want to believe in the resurrection, then that's fine, right? But it's really just a decision that you make in faith. And so this morning, the object of the game is to expose the myth that faith is the only way that you can believe this. Right. And we're going to try and destroy that myth. And so the fact is that there are very good historical reasons to believe that Jesus really rose from the dead. And I think that if you kind of keep an open mind and survey this material yourself, then I think you can come to the same conclusion. So we're going to look at 7 different evidences for the historicity of the resurrection this morning. First one is the execution itself. And so how do we know that Jesus really died in the way that the Bible describes? And so what if you just like completely burned the New Testament? And so like if you pretended that the New Testament didn't exist at all. And so then we could appeal to the hostile, non-Christian historians of the time and see what they say about the execution of Jesus. And so we're going to make 3 quick points here. And the first is that the Romans recorded the execution of Jesus exactly as the New Testament describes. And so Tacitus wrote the book Annals in about 110 or 120 AD. And so we're like early 2nd century here. So again, this is Cornelius Tacitus. This is section 1544 of his book. And it says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. And so if you read the whole section here, he goes on to say that these Christians believe in this crazy superstition, right? There are tons of these Christians, and he really, really seems to hate them by the way that he talks about them. He almost sounds like there's a plague of these people that came out of Judea and all the way to Rome. They're in every social strata. They're both male and female. He's like neck deep in Christians and, in Rome at this point. And he says that they're called Christians, but, where would they get that name? And he says that they're called Christians because Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And of course, Christus is the Latinized version of Christ. And Tacitus says that this is where the name comes from. And that's exactly what it says in Acts 11. So he also mentions that this Christus suffered the extreme penalty. And we learned last week or the week before, I don't remember. That's exactly how proper Romans would refer to crucifixion. They viewed it as too extreme to actually mention it by name. So they had these euphemisms for it. And so the modern word excruciating actually gets its etymology from crucifixion. It kind of means out of the cross. And so anyway, Tacitus is certainly referring to crucifixion here when he says the extreme penalty. And he says that this happened during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, who died in 37 AD. And so the crucifixion of Jesus was in 33 AD-ish, so that fits. And it was under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, who left power in 36 AD. So that fits too, all right? Tacitus is teaching the same history that the Bible is teaching. And so we're not actually going to read all of the excerpts that we could, but suffice it to say that the Romans did record the death of Jesus just as the Bible does. The Greeks recorded it too. So Lucian was a Greek satirist in the 2nd century, and he refers to Christians as the waste spewing out of Antioch and into the rest of the world. So he's not a Christian. And so in his book, The Death of Peregrine, he says that Christians believe that they are immortal for all of time. And he says that they are pretty good people, right? They're just delusional. They have no idea what they're talking about. He makes a big deal out of the fact that Christians pray and sing to their crucified sage. He calls him Jesus, as if this sage is still alive. And so the exact same thing here is recorded by the Greeks. Also, the Jews recorded it. And so in the Babylonian Talmud, they refer to Jesus as Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth, and they say that he was hanged on the eve of Passover, okay, which is the day before Passover, which incidentally does not line up with the Last Supper being a Passover meal. And it does line up with the timeline that I proposed in our teachings on the Old Testament festivals. They say that he was killed because he led Israel astray with miracles and sorcery. All right, so they didn't even deny that Jesus was a miracle worker. They just believed that he got his power from Satan and not from God. And this is exactly what Matthew chapter 12 tells us that the Jews of Jesus's day thought about him. And so, if we were in a court of law and there were 3 people that were totally hostile towards you, but they came in and supported your story, that would pretty much authenticate and verify your version of the story. And that's kind of, what we have here when we look at the evidence for the death of Jesus. These people are not friends of Christianity, and yet they verify exactly what the Bible says. And so, did Jesus die on a cross under Pontius Pilate, under Emperor Tiberius, in the time frame that the Bible describes? Yes. Okay, he absolutely did. And so that's our first piece in building an evidence for this. And so the next thing is the empty tomb. Gary Habermas says that there are 29 historical reasons to believe in the empty tomb. We're going to do 2 of them. All right, so you're welcome. The fact is that the historical evidence for the tomb, for the empty tomb, is so strong that even hostile historians affirm the empty tomb, exactly as the Bible teaches it, right? So why would they do that? All right, I'm going to read you a quote from D.H. Van Dalen. This guy is an extreme critic of the New Testament, but he writes, it's extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. All right. And so why would an atheistic, hostile critic of the New Testament and Christianity believe anything that's in the Bible, much less the empty tomb? All right. So here's a couple of reasons why. And the first is that the Bible teaches that women were the first to witness the empty tomb. All right. So all four Gospels record that it was women who found the tomb empty on Sunday morning. The passage in Matthew is nowhere near unique in that respect. And so why would women witnesses matter? Well, in first century Palestine, women weren't allowed to testify in any court of law. All right. And so think about that for a minute. A Palestinian woman could witness any heinous act, and it wasn't valid testimony. So if a woman was the only witness, then it didn't happen. All right. So yeah, it's sexist, but that's the way it was. Josephus wrote this. It says, but let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex, nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on account of the ignobility of their soul. So they didn't allow women or slaves in the courtroom because they might have some ulterior motive. All right, so imagine that you're Matthew or one of the other first century gospel writers. You're deceiving the world and making up a new religion called Christianity. And you're writing the story that we read this morning. You get to the part with the empty tomb and you're trying to decide who to have as the witnesses for the empty tomb. How about Peter? Right? He's the leader of the early church. How about James? He was the brother of Jesus. How about one of the other disciples? How about any man alive? Okay, no. How about a couple of women? And one of these women is Mary Magdalene, which Luke chapter 8 says was demon possessed before Jesus healed her. So the first witnesses of this event is a group of people that customarily wouldn't be believed in court. And one of them has a reputation as like the village crazy. All right. And so considering the time and the place that this happened, this is the worst group of witnesses possible. Okay. So pulling names out of a hat would have been a lot better. And so if the disciples were forging this story, surely they could have done better than this. And so Robert Stein has a filter through which you can view history called the criteria for authenticity. And one of the criteria is embarrassment. If a historical narrative has something that's embarrassing or that the people would like to hide, then it is incredibly likely that it happened. And so another criteria is multiple attestation. And so if it's attested in multiple places, then it's also very likely. And so this is attested in multiple places. It's attested in all four Gospels. And so critics of the Bible look at this and they decide that, well, this must have been the way that it happened, because no conspirator in the world would write the story this way. Okay, only a historian would write the story this way, or at least someone who was, felt pretty committed to the facts. So the second reason to believe the empty tomb is the burial story. Okay, the guys in the Sanhedrin, which is like the Supreme Court of Israel, are like the rock stars of ancient Israel. All right, politically and religiously, these guys are the upper echelon. And the Bible records that there were 2 members of this 70-man group of guys that are involved in this story. And so one of them is Joseph of Arimathea, and the other is Nicodemus. And so the biblical account is that 2 members of this Sanhedrin went and asked Pilate for the body of Jesus, and then they asked that he be put in a rich man's grave. Well, it doesn't sound that weird. All right. So I don't know what you're talking about. It is weird. All right. So Mark records that the whole council, that's the entire Sanhedrin, voted for Jesus's death. And now, like 1 day later, 3 days later, whatever, Joseph of Arimathea is asking for the body. And so if you do some reading from the 2nd century church leaders, you'll see that by then, by the 2nd century, the church had turned very anti-Semitic. And in the 2nd generation, the church had gone like kind of mostly Gentile, and it became pretty hostile to the Jewish people in general. So if you were going to approach this as just some secular historical document, could you imagine the disciples putting their story and the future of their belief system in the hands of the enemy? All right, if you were making this story up, you would say that these evil men that put Jesus on the cross are also the guys that came and asked for the body to be honored and taken care of in burial. All right, these Sanhedrin guys are famous. If this story is falsified, how long would it take for someone to go, no, that's not what happened? Okay, so the disciples named 2 members of the Sanhedrin who were the absolute enemy of Christianity, and they turned over the fate of their story to these Sanhedrin guys, denying or affirming that this is how it happened. And so the principles of embarrassment and multiple attestation apply here too. All 4 gospels mention this. John's the only one that actually mentions Nicodemus, but the others all mention Joseph of Arimathea. And so we've done the execution and the empty tomb. The next one is the expectation of someone rising from the dead. Was there the expectation that the Messiah would raise from the dead? Was there the expectation that the Jewish Messiah would be killed and 3 days later raised from the dead? Was there anything that was headed in this direction? Did the Jews expect that this would happen? All right. Was there a non-Jewish expectation that that would happen? That pretty much covers everybody, doesn't it? Right? Like Jewish and non-Jewish. Some of this stuff sounds much better when I write it than when I say it. But what was the Jewish expectation? All right. So N.T. Wright has a book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. I haven't read the whole book, but I did read the chapters on the Jewish expectations of the Messiah. Wright very carefully goes through the Old Testament and he looks at every single messianic passage, and he denies that any Jew before the time of Christ believed that the scriptures referred to a dying and rising Messiah. All right. It just is not in the Old Testament in a way that it can be expected. Okay. And then he goes through all of the extra biblical Jewish literature, and he doesn't find a single passage that refers to a resurrection. Not a single rabbi or Jew interprets the passages that way. The Jews were expecting the Messiah to be a reigning ruler and a conquering king. Before Jesus, there was no interpretation of the Messiah that expected a suffering servant. When the Messiah shows up, he's not supposed to die. He's supposed to kill people. Messiah doesn't get hung on a cross. He hangs other people on crosses. So that's the way that Messiah is supposed to roll when he shows up, according to the Jewish expectation. That's just what they believed. And so imagine that you're a first century Jew and this teacher shows up, all right, Jesus of Nazareth, and a week later he gets nailed to a Roman cross and he dies. He absolutely cannot be the Messiah. Okay, Messiahs don't get killed. They're the guy who liberates us from Roman oppression. All right, so there was absolutely no Jewish expectation that the Messiah would die and be resurrected. But what about the non-Jewish expectations? What about the Greeks and the Romans? And so I'm going to again appeal to N.T. Wright's research again. He really has done the work on this one. This book may be his greatest contribution to biblical knowledge. All right, so there's a myth that there were these dying and rising gods in Greco-Roman thought. And that's just what that is. It's a myth. So Brian Fleming has a documentary movie that's all about how Christianity sucks. It's called The God Who's Not There. And he says that Christianity stole the idea of a dying and rising God from Osiris and Mithra and all these other Greco-Roman deities. And the Zeitgeist film says the same thing. Christianity is basically just a pagan religion that stole all of this material from pagan sources and just called it Christian. It's kind of an audacious claim. They must have some end note at the end of the documentary that verifies some of this stuff. No, there's nothing there. All right. There's actually not a single primary source before the time of Christ that refers to a dying and rising God. Okay. It doesn't exist. The movie says that it does, but you can't actually go to a library and find anything on this. There are no books that say that this is true. And so the Greek thinkers of this time were called Neoplatonists, and they believed in a bifurcation of the soul and the body. And so that means that they believed that the soul was pure and the body was nasty and sinful and disgusting. And so when a person died, the good soul leaves the nasty body and went on a one-way trip to the afterlife. And so would that soul ever come back? All right, and attach itself to the nastiness of the body again? No. The Greek thinkers were pretty disgusted at a thought like that. They had no bent towards this at all in the worldview at the time. And so the earliest mention of a dying and rising God other than Christ comes 150 years after the New Testament is written. So if anyone is stealing from someone, it's like the Greco-Roman thinkers stealing from Christianity. So, was there some non-Jewish expectation that the Messiah would die and rise from the dead? No, there was not. And yet, starting abruptly in 33 AD, in the next 65 years or so, about 10,000 Jews and almost 1 million other people come to believe fervently that Jesus has risen from the dead. Which brings us to our fourth reason. All right, that's the eyewitnesses. Is there good reason to believe that the eyewitnesses bear good testimony for this? All right, so we're going to appeal to an atheistic German scholar named Gerd Ludemann. This guy has written more against the resurrection of Christ than any other scholar on earth. Okay, this was one of the most hostile anti-Christian men on planet Earth. He died a year ago. And he says that it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Why in the world would a hostile critic of the Bible write that this is not just probable, but historically certain? Well, I'll tell you what persuaded Ludemann. Now, this guy does believe that this is a myth. He believes that it was like a hallucination or a vision or something, not a real resurrection. But he does believe that the disciples thought that they experienced something that was very real. And the first reason for that is Paul. Okay, so critics of the Bible affirm that Saul of Tarsus was a real guy. Even Richard Dawkins says in The God Delusion that Paul lived and he existed and planted churches. So Paul was a persecutor of the early church. Every single document that we have from him references the fact that he was a persecutor of the church. And yet he does this 180-degree turn after he claims to have encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus. And so Paul's a violent persecutor of the church. He's totally separate from the other disciples. Galatians 1 says that he had no affiliation with them at all. And yet he had this like sighting of Jesus and he turned his life around. The second reason is James, all right? Not James, the son of Zebedee, who died in 44 AD at the hand of Herod Agrippa. This is James, the little brother of Jesus. And so according to the Bible, James didn't really believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Mark 3:21 says that Jesus's family thought he was completely insane, and they were trying to get him to stop preaching. John 7:5 says that even his brothers didn't believe in him. And among those brothers would be James. But then in 1 Corinthians 15:7, we read that Jesus appeared to James. And that must have been an interesting conversation, right? Jesus is recruiting his little brother, James, to work for him. And after that point in the Bible, James turns from being a skeptic and not a believer in Jesus to becoming like a pillar of the early church. In Galatians 1, Paul goes up to Jerusalem a little time after his own conversion, and he bumps into James, who is essentially leading the early local church. And then in Acts 15, James is at the very center of the Jerusalem council. He's actually presiding over the other apostles and helping them to make decisions. In Acts 21, it also says that James is leading the church in Jerusalem. And then he's not really written about in the rest of the New Testament. Right, but then there's Josephus, who was not a believer, writing sometime after this, says that James, Jesus' brother, was brought before the Jewish Sanhedrin, and he was stoned to death because he wouldn't recant faith in his brother. All right, so there were other messianic movements that occurred in and around like the 1st and 2nd century. There were actually a few, but whenever the Messiah figure would be killed, the followers would typically completely abandon faith in that person. And so in 135 AD, Simon Bar, what's his name, Kokhba, led the Bar Kokhba revolt. He's killed by the Romans and Jerusalem's torn up pretty bad. But afterwards, they called Simon Bar Kokhba Simon Bar Kosaba, which changes his name from son of the star to son of lies. Okay, and so once you said that you were the Messiah, but then you get killed, right? Like you're completely swept away by the Jewish people. They had no tolerance for failed messiahs. And there were a bunch of them, actually. But typically when a Messiah would die, the movement would kind of try to keep going by raising up the dead Messiah's brother. All right. And it would move along with the brother until he gets killed too. But the New Testament account is different than that. After Jesus dies, James didn't take over the Messianic movement. He claimed that he was still underneath Jesus because Jesus is risen from the dead. He didn't take over the movement as the new Messiah. Instead, he died to insist that his brother was still the Messiah. The next reason is that the 12 disciples all went to gruesome and torturous deaths. They're boiled in oil, they're skinned alive, they were run through by spears, crucified upside down, beheaded. Okay, they're all, separate at the time. They're all in different parts of the earth. John was the only one to survive, and he was boiled in oil. Okay, and then he's exiled to the island of Patmos. The other 11 died these horrible deaths in separate corners of the world, and not a single one of them would recant their faith in Christ, even though every one of them was given the chance to do that. They each went to their brutal deaths unwilling to say that they didn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. All right, so that brings us to our fifth reason to believe in the historical resurrection. This is that the whole event is explained in advance. All right, so we just said that there was no expectation of a, dead and rising Messiah, but the Bible does contain the foretelling of this. The Bible describes the whole event before it happens, even if nobody interpreted it that way beforehand. This is Isaiah 53. It says, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. So some people have wondered if, the suffering servant was supposed to be killed. Yeah, he sure was. This phrase here always refers to a violent death, cut off out of the land of the living. His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. So wait a minute. He was just cut off from the land of the living, right? He had a grave with wicked men, it says. He was with a rich man in his death. And yet verse 10 says that he will prolong his days and he will continue to live. And so it looks like Isaiah knew that this Messiah would be killed and come back to life. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. So if you had friends that weren't Christians, but are reasonably open to the possibility that some of this is true, try this. All right, move Isaiah 53 into a Word document. Eliminate all of the verse divisions and any other evidence that it's from the Bible. Print it out and ask them to read it. Okay, when they're done reading, ask them who they think it's describing. Chances are pretty good that they'll say it sounds like Jesus. Okay, but this passage is written 750 years before Jesus is born. We have a copy of this passage from Cave 1 at Qumran. Okay, it's carbon dated to 150 BC. Okay, so like that might make your friends think for a minute. All right, so this was certainly predicted in advance, and it predicted that Jesus would come back from death. Psalm 22 is the one that we read the beginning of last week. And this cannot be talking about David, who's the author. All right, First Kings says that David died a peaceful death. But, you know, David's writing in the first person of this future righteous sufferer. And David says that his tongue sticks to the roof of his mouth. They pierced his hands and feet. They gamble for my clothes. We read all that last week. Verses 1 through 22 refer to the death and suffering of this like righteous sufferer. And the next half of the psalm refers to his resurrection. And so Jesus quoted the first line of this psalm from the cross when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? All right. He also kind of quoted the last line when he said, it is finished. All right. The way that David puts it and the way that we have it translated in the psalm is he has performed it. All right. So Jesus pretty much put brackets around this psalm from the cross. It says that all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. All the prosperous of the earth will eat and worship. All those who go down to the dust will bow before him, even he who cannot keep his soul alive. So David just described this righteous sufferer who will have his hands and his feet pierced. And he's saying that as a result of that death, all the ends of the earth, all the families of the nations, and all the prosperous of the earth will come to believe in the God of Israel. They'll read the Jewish Old Testament as their Bible. So this is kind of crazy because, right, like because of this death of this person, people from all over the world are going to believe in the God of Israel. All right. Posterity will serve him. It will be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They will come and will declare his righteousness to a people who will be born, that he has performed it. So David is saying that there will be this righteous sufferer, and generations following his death, people will still be talking about him and his death. It sounds a little boastful, right? Like that the God of Israel will become the God of all these other nations just because of this one guy's suffering. David Barrett wrote a book around 2001. It's called World Christian Trends. It's a large and expensive book, and it's full of statistics and data. It actually ends up being quite damning for modern Christians, but he updated it every couple of years until he died in 2001. And he's updating it to describe how far the message has actually gotten in the world. All right, so another guy's updating it now. I don't know his name, but this trend that we're going to bring up has continued the same since he originally wrote it. This is what he wrote. It says in 1900, over 80% of all Christians were white. Most were from Europe and North America. Today, that percentage has fallen to 45%. It's lower than that now. The demographic center of Christianity is now found in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Over the next 25 years, the white portion of global Christianity is expected to continue to decline dramatically. So that was a pretty good prediction. All right, we're now over 20 years from when this was originally written, and that is exactly what has happened. Okay, Christianity is exploding in exactly the regions that this guy names. Check this out. The country with the fastest Christian expansion ever is China. now at 10,000 new converts every day. That was a long time ago that he wrote that. Okay. And it's more now. 10,000 Chinese people come to know Christ every day. From only 3 million in AD 1500, evangelicals have grown to 648 million worldwide, 54% being non-whites. It's closer to 60 now. All right. And so it sounds like King David was right after all. Could you imagine making this prediction 3,000 years ago? That there would be Africans and Asians, whites, Latins, Indians who all pick up the Hebrew Bible and read the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as their story. They believe in the God of Israel as a result of this like righteous sufferer's death. All right, so let's move to number 6. This is the expansion of Christianity. All right, so you may or may not have known that this movement grew from, 500 people to 1 million people by the end of the 1st century, according to Barrett. So this was an explosive grassroots movement that came out of Jerusalem and Judea. 2,000-fold growth in 70 years. Kenneth Latourette writes this. He says, never in the history of the race has this record ever quite been equaled. Never in so short a time has any other religious faith, or for that matter, any other set of ideas, religious, political, or economic, without the aid of physical force or of social or cultural prestige, achieved so commanding a position in such an important culture. So like communism has spread very quickly at times, okay, but it's under the threat of violence. It was convert to communism or die, okay? And so other religious movements have spread quickly too, under the threat of the sword. All right, but the difference is that in the 1st century, Christianity didn't spread by the sword. It spread while it was under threat of the sword. That is, like if you converted to Christianity, you're putting your whole family at risk, and you would probably be tortured to death. There was every possible incentive not to turn to Christianity and every reason to choose any other thing to believe. And so this 1st century movement has never been equal in that way. And that brings us to the last reason to believe in the resurrection. That's experience. All right. People are still saying that their life was in the gutter, or that they're living for all the wrong things. And that changed when they had a direct encounter with Jesus Christ. All right. So that's not an easy thing to explain. Maybe, none of this evidence matters all that much, except that if Jesus is still alive, then you can still have a direct encounter with him this morning. All right, we don't need to keep all these numbered reasons and quoted historian stuff up on the screen like this is just some kind of academic study. Okay, if Jesus is really still alive, then he would answer prayers and you could know him personally. And he does answer prayers, and you can know him personally. Okay, and so like that pretty much brings us to conclusions for this morning. And the first one is that the resurrection is essential to the Christian faith. There's no such thing as Christian faith that leaves out the resurrection. The Bible completely disagrees with the concept that these things can exist apart from one another. Jesus rose physically from the dead. The resurrection is the best explanation for the historical facts that we have. There are other possible explanations for the resurrection story, but what we're actually arguing this morning is that the physical resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation. It's the difference between like anything's possible, all right, and what's the most probable thing, or what's the most likely thing to have had to explain all of these things. And I thought we could just end on this note, right? You talk to a lot of people that when the subject of the afterlife comes up, or, like what happens after you die, they believe in an afterlife and they think that they might be going to heaven, all right? But they just don't think that there's any real way to be sure. And so they sure hope that they're going to heaven, but they honestly believe that you cannot know where you're going until after you get there. And so that means that most people that are like walking around today are flying by the seat of their pants and hoping that they are judged kindly after they die. They're banking on the fact that God will accept them because they never killed anybody, or because they can think of lots of worse people than themselves. And I think that it's a reasonable response to the question, like, do you believe that a loving God would want you to wonder and be completely unsure of your eternal fate for the length of your life? Right? I think that that's an interesting thing to consider. Does it make any sense that that's what a loving God would want for you? All right? God would not want that. God is not like that at all. He doesn't want you to live your life in fear and insecurity, wondering where you're going to go when you die. A loving God would want to give you certainty in advance so that, knowing what was going to happen to you when you die could affect the way that you live. All right. And so, I would encourage every one of you to seek that certainty. Turn to God this morning while we pray, while we sing. Ask him to count your sins among those that Jesus died for and rose to prove that it worked. Okay, ask him to fill you with certainty of your eternal standing with him. All right, if you would like some help with that kind of a prayer, turn to someone come see me after this is over. Anyone would be happy to help you. That's kind of it, right? So the mortality rate for human beings is 100%. All right. And you know it. All right. That's not news. Every one of us needs to get this worked out.